Thank you so much for coming here. 3 years ago, almost to the date, in a room very similar to this, a comment was made at the CIEE conference in Brooklyn. I was there in the audience, sitting where you were sitting. And everybody in the room, or most people in the room, all commiserated in laughter, frustration, and it really irked me. And it was something that irked me, and I couldn't get over it. And for about a year, I just steamed about it. I was similarly like, what is going on? Why do we keep doing this thing? When we talk about students, we're constantly thinking that we talk about them in a certain way, and it doesn't affect the way that we treat them. It doesn't affect the way that they feel in our offices. And it just kept eating at me, okay? And I started talking to other people about it. Do you know what skunking is? Skunking is non-direct communication about other people that you have problems with, that you have no intention of actually directly addressing with them. It's a really unhealthy habit. Any Brene Brown fans in here? So skunking is a really terrible practice for healthy relationships across the board. And I feel like this comment made at the CIEE conference in Brooklyn was an example and sort of a breaking point for me. And it took me over a year to figure out what I wanted to do about it. Because it wasn't solving anything for me to talk about how much I hated how people in our field, professionals, would talk about students. We would talk about students in ways when they weren't around that they would never talk about them when they were in the room. And this principle applies to many things in our lives that we would never question. What is it like if you skunk or talk poorly about your partner to other people? It affects your relationship. It affects other people's opinions about those people, right? So I didn't know, why is this so acceptable? So I started digging and trying to figure this out. I'm Tony. I work at Kalamazoo College. I'm the assistant director of student engagement there. And it's no accident that that's my position and my title. I love working with students. And I also have a unique experience that I think informs what we do in our field. If we have any hopes to grow our field, not only in numbers, but in what we're doing, in rethinking how we're doing global education, we need to do better at how we think about, talk about, and work with students. And if we have any hopes of applying any of the DEI principles or the Jedi principles, we cannot do them by merely thinking about them internally and then becoming better people, and then the students sort of magically know that we're more inclusive, more inviting, and more welcoming. We literally have to change the way we think and communicate about students if we're going to achieve this. So I'm going to ask you to use a certain frame for thinking about the rest of the session today. How many of you in here are academic directors, resident directors, enrollment administrators, advisors, coordinators? These are all the top hats. These are your jobs. You're professionals. You've got your degrees in it. You've got some experience in it. And these top hats are sometimes a safety mechanism or a defense mechanism that we put on when we're mad at students. I'm a professional. Why don't they read their emails? If they just read their email, they wouldn't be emailing me again to explain something. So for today's session, I want you to all, symbolically with me, take off those top hats a second, and then put them to the side. Good. I got one person. Everybody, get those top hats. I need everybody engaged in this. Thank you. All right. Now, you don't like your hair today? That's fine. I'm going to put another hat on, okay? We're putting on a construction worker's hat. We're going to do some work in here today. I hope it makes you feel a little uncomfortable. This hat I want you to put on is to accept the premise that you're all teacher learners and learner teachers. This is a very popular concept in Freirean education, or popular education. Anybody heard of Freire, Paulo Freire? Popular education is based on this principle that all education should be aimed at liberation. It's not about memorizing a certain data set. If there is no liberation involved in an educational process, it is always going to serve the needs of oppression and where the train was already going. We're not going to challenge anything. And I tell you, we need to challenge things. So just an idea of where we're going today. I'm going to first describe to you what solidarity has come to mean to me, why I believe solidarity is a really useful concept to think about how we work with students, and then how to do solidarity with students. We'll have some Q&A, and then the most exciting part is going to be our workshop at the end. What is solidarity? I used to run a study abroad program in Mexico for almost 8 years. And I traveled to Mexico with students from all over the United States and actually some from around the world who wanted to learn about social justice and what really powerful Mexican social movements are doing to fight for indigenous rights, women's rights, workers' rights. And so I was, semester after semester, surrounded by radical students from the United States and elsewhere who wanted to fight for change. Now, I started doing this job when I had just finished grad school, so I was 31. And my whole time there, was one of the program directors of the Mexico program, but this organization that I used to work for, we also developed a program in Cuba as well. So on the program in Mexico, our organization's name was Mexico Solidarity Network, and it was born out of a solidarity with the political movements in Mexico. Here's one example in Tlaxcala, Mexico. And we worked with CNUC, the Consejo Nacional Urbano y Campesino. Luz here in the front in the white shirt, she's a good friend of mine, and one of the most powerful organizers I've ever met in my entire life. Has been tirelessly fighting for women's rights, workers' rights, and in this picture, she's surrounded by my students as well as ex-braceros workers. Anybody familiar with the bracero program was? Yeah, good. Really disturbing part of U.S. history, where the United States and Mexico came to an agreement to allow workers to come to the United States. And they promised them if they went back after their contracts ended that they would return 10% of their wages that they would hold from them until they went back. That 10% was never given, and UC Berkeley estimated that this was worth collectively over the 30-some years of the program of billions of dollars that was stolen from all of these laborers. So these ex-braceros workers taught our students about their struggle of fighting against both the Mexican and U.S. government to reclaim those wages. Luz, in this case, is not an ex-bracero worker, but she organizes with them. And so this is an example of solidarity that we learned on our study abroad program. But in addition to what we learned about how solidarity worked in Mexico, there's also something else going on. This is me. This is my first study abroad program that I ran. I was the lead professor, also the van driver. I don't know if anyone else can relate to this, but I wear a lot of hats. This is my first group of students. It was a really powerful experience, and I want to kind of frame it like this to say, I would argue that I was on a study abroad program to learn about what young people are thinking when they want to change the world. Because not only were we learning about these powerful movements in Mexico, but these students who are really charged with wanting to change the world also had a lot of opinions about how I did my job. So I was very constantly reminded of some of Daniel's students studied with me in Mexico. But they were learning these lessons from powerful movements in Mexico, and then sometimes they would want to challenge me. And so they would say, well, we're learning these principles of autonomy and agency. So, what about you? And being a gringo, I'm a white guy from West Michigan, but I have spent a lot of time in Mexico in solidarity with movements there. There was a lot of questions about my right to be there. Why was I their professor for this program? And I had to have many, many, many hours of conversations over 8 years with students because they wanted to work through their processes of what they were thinking about me, what they were thinking about what they were learning. And so this experience led me to learn a lot about students and led me to learn a lot about myself. If you let them, students are an incredible mirror to learn about yourself. But that requires vulnerability. This is a picture of me with the last program that I ran in 2016, and I use this image compared to the other image because in this image, look at me, I'm standing in front of the group, my arms are crossed, look at me, I'm so tough. And this doesn't exactly symbolize what I was like on the program, but it serves as a useful reminder that when I started the program, I was very insecure about my right to be there. And so I had issues and difficulties trying to figure out, like, well, I do deserve to be here. I am qualified for this job. And toward the end, I had learned through multiple programs how to treat students differently and how to incorporate them in a process of education that wasn't such a top-down process. One of the things that being in solidarity with anyone requires is mutual investment. Solidarity cannot be a one-way process. If you believe you're doing solidarity and it's only you giving or you thinking that you're helping others, and you have no skin in the game, you have nothing to improve upon yourself, you have no work to be done internally or back home where you're from, it's not solidarity. It's something else. It might be charity. It might be something like you're just doing a project, but it's not the same thing as solidarity. You need mutual investment. You also need tailored vulnerability. And I want to make a point here to say, the reason I say tailored is that vulnerability is a really sticky thing and involves lots of different kinds of privileges. So my take, you can take this or leave it, my take is that the more privilege you have institutionally, race, gender, sexuality, the more responsibility you have to make yourselves vulnerable. I want that to sink in with you, what I'm saying. The more access to institutional power you have, the more the obligation is on you to make sure people know they have a right to even question you. It's not on other people. They also have a right and need to work on probably figuring out how to challenge power, and we worked on that in the program, but they can't do it automatically without there being an invitation, and especially when thinking about working with students. The other thing is that there's no recipe. It's not just add ingredient X, Y, and Z, and then you have solidarity. But the way you do it has to always affirm agency, recognition of people's ability to make choices for themselves. I want to just mention a second some of my biggest influences in addition to my experience. Mia Henry is a really good friend of mine who runs Justice at Work. She does now mostly online virtual training. She used to do incredible civil rights history tours in the South. And her workshops that she does gets at the heart of this idea of how do we enact justice in our workplaces. Ritu Bhasin was a speaker, a keynote speaker, I think at the CIEE conference a few years ago, and blew my mind with her idea of the authenticity principle. And she does a really good job explaining it, how you can scale your authenticity, and that people who are oppressed and who have been intentionally, strategically oppressed for many, many hundreds of years, they have a choice to make about what kinds of authenticity they bring to work. But they do need to find a way to still be themselves at work, without necessarily exposing themselves to being hurt. And then Dr. Paul Hernandez, he did an amazing talk at a different conference I went to on the pedagogy of real talk. And he emphasized this idea of how administrators, professionals, faculty, you need to be real with your students. You need to level with your students if they're going to trust you. What are we doing holding up this idea that our field and our jobs are somehow perfect? Somehow we are perfect? So all three of these folks are amazing. I hope you look into their work as well. Mia's definition of solidarity that she uses I find really useful. I don't like reading from slides. I trust you. I also want to define solidarity by what it isn't. It's not helping. If you're in the field of international education because you love education generally and you want to help students learn, okay, it has a minimal depth. It's also not patronizing. It's not pitying or reinforcing the same systemic inequalities that we're trying to actually deconstruct and undo. So if you're doing patronizing work with students, you're not undoing the same systems of paternalization, patriarchy that we're trying to demolish in our lifetimes. We're trying to work against these things. If you're reproducing that with students, you're only helping the mainstream systems of oppression. But I also want to make sure to say that it doesn't mean the customer's always right. I think there's a misassociation with this because people think, if I'm vulnerable with students and I share about mistakes I've made, they're going to pounce. And that means I just got to go with anything they do. Anything they say or do, that means it's right. That's not true. We have to have healthy boundaries. We know we have to get visa deadlines. We have to get plane tickets. We have to get them to the excursions safely and back. So it doesn't mean that they're always right and they always need to win. But I'll give you an example. My students in Mexico, I came back after they were staying in a community. I would go back, work on grading their papers, and come back to pick them up, and their assignments were due. And one time, one of the students had decided to be a representative of the group and told me, we, as a collective, we have decided we are not turning in our assignments. We've been so fully engaged in what we're learning. We don't believe we need to deliver it to you. So there. So I'm like, okay. So I had about a 3.5-hour conversation from like 9 until 11:30 p.m. with them, starting with the premise of, well, it seems to me you don't consider me part of your collective. That opened the conversation to talking about what does it mean to me for them to turn their assignments in, how much time I spend on them, how much it prepares them for the classes that we have, and how much we are constantly moving on the program, and if they don't turn this one in now, and they delay it, and then I don't get to write and grade it, I had to explain all of that, and if I were to put my top hat back on as a professional and say, I'm the professor, turn it in, what do you think would have happened in week 4 of my 15-week program? Mutiny. And maybe not mutiny in terms of them actually taking the van and driving wherever they want, but mutiny in the sense I would have lost them. I would have lost their trust. I had to work through it with them. It takes time. Why solidarity? There are 4 main reasons I'm going to go through pretty quickly here. Economics in class. At Kalamazoo College, which I'm lucky to have one of our students in the audience here, she's actually studying in Seoul with CIEE. The average Kalamazoo College student is going to graduate with about $30,000 in debt. Not only is that more than what I had in debt from undergrad and grad school, we are in a different economy. Wages are still stagnant. Our students graduating from undergraduate degrees have no promise that that undergraduate degree will land them a permanent job with good health care and an ability to even think about buying a home. We are in a radically different situation. So we should consider solidarity with students. They are in a different situation generationally than you were, most likely, depending on your ages. If we have any hopes of doing any of this incredibly important equity work, and have any hopes of increasing the numbers of marginalized students and students who have been prevented from entering educational spaces for centuries, we need a different model. It cannot just be like, well, why don't more people study abroad? We've got new scholarships, and now they should really do it because of the money. It's not only money, people. That's a very superficial analysis. We need a different way. Students want and deserve it. I've worked with many, many groups of students in Mexico, as well as at Kalamazoo College. I used to teach high school. Students want different, authentic relationships than what sometimes we're willing to give. Lastly, I hope this is actually going to sell you. If the first 3 didn't, this last one will. I want to tell you, if you enter into a solidarity relationship with a student or with students, they have your back. I don't know if any of you feel incredibly secure in your jobs, that you never need anybody to have your back. But if you're in solidarity with people, they're also looking out for you because you have skin in the game too. You have something to lose. So it can actually be an incredible support. I'm teaching a class at Kalamazoo College focused on social justice, social movements, global social justice movements, and public speaking. And I told them this morning at 4 a.m., which is their time, 2 p.m., I was like, I'm getting ready to do my persuasive speech. I'm going to try to convince these colleagues. And then they started writing back in the Teams chat like, you got this, come on. It's a different kind of relation. Don't make me tear up. I am an easy crier. So there's a really added benefit for you as well. It is not a one-way relationship. So how? How do we do solidarity? I'm going to give you two metaphors because I am a fan of metaphors. I'm a communication and rhetorical theory guy. And so Metaphors We Live By was a really famous book by Lakoff and Johnson. I read when I was in sophomore year of my undergrad. And Metaphors We Live By basically says every word is a metaphor. Every metaphor and the way we speak about things affects how we act upon those things. So I'm going to use two metaphors to give you an idea of how to do solidarity. Anybody in here gardeners? What did you plant this summer?
Okra, squash, tomato.
Okra, amazing, awesome. Corn. The squirrels and the chipmunks decimate every attempt I've ever made at corn growing, and I want to do it so bad. Anybody that plants gardens knows you have to plant more seeds than you anticipate actually letting grow to fruition. So when you're doing solidarity with students, it's not about 1 + 1 = 2 and it's done. A lot of times doing solidarity work means you need to actually plant more and make more attempts at solidarity than you might even see, especially in the immediate. A lot of the examples of solidarity of students and me came 5 years after they did the study abroad program with me in Mexico. And that takes patience, just like gardening. You also have to pay attention. You don't just plant, you don't throw your seeds in the garden beds and then hope the summer goes well. You're always looking for weeds, for pests, all these kinds of things. So when you're doing solidarity work with students, you actually have to tend to those relationships. It's not you do it and then it's automatic. The other metaphor is exercise. This is a bit problematic because I don't really like exercising. I don't know if anybody else agrees with that. But in exercise, it's never an arrival. You don't just show up. You don't do the thing. I ran this morning at the hotel out of pure, I would say, losing my mind from lack of sleep for 5 days. And it was the first time in probably 6 months I've done any sort of exercise. But it's not an arrival, as we all know. When you do exercise, it's something you got to kind of keep reminding yourself to do. You don't just do it and then it's done. Similar to solidarity with students. It's not easy or natural. Getting out of bed to do it, fitting it into your workday. We're all busy. That top hat is so tempting. It's always tempting to be like, oh, I've got so many damn emails. How am I supposed to be exercising solidarity when I've got to do all this business stuff, right? It's worth it, though, to carve it out. In coaching, as a metaphor for the exercise, it really pairs well with this idea. Coaching is a more useful term, I think, when you're working with students and trying to create a solidarity relationship. I want to give you a few examples because I can easily be accused of saying, you believe all this stuff, but like, what does it actually look like? So this is the how of like what I've been a part of. So this is some examples of student solidarity in the policies and practices. So our office, a few years ago, realized that we do program coordinator orientations. So I'm a program coordinator for all the programs in Asia, Jordan, Cuba, Colombia, and Brazil. And we would go into these program coordinator orientations to prepare the students to go to these countries that we, in a lot of cases, have never been to in our lives. And then we get to like all the logistics about your credits and your air travel, all that stuff. And then we get to like culture in Colombia. I've never been. I've been to other Latin American countries, not the same. So if I try and attempt at saying, well, this is what I've heard, this is what I've read about Colombian culture, we end up feeling really silly and stupid. And a lot of us feel that way. So we decided we're going to outsource this to the students. A lot of times the students are taking classes and have professors that know a lot more about the cultures and the countries that we're going to send them to. So we started a very different model of that. That actually made students feel really cool if they're not too shy at the beginning, but you've got to pull it out, you've got to have that relationship, is to have them tell us, what do you know about already? And then also admitting, as a program coordinator, I don't know what Colombian culture is like. I've never been there. I'm going in March. So it's a vulnerability that you're sharing. It's an opportunity for students to share. Our staff at my office, we've been doing readings. We read Dr. Kennedy's book on how to be an anti-racist, for an example. And it's not just reading it. But we were reading it as a staff and talking about each chapter and how to apply it to our actual work, to our website, to our policies, how to become and how to be anti-racist as opposed to, I don't want someone to call us racist. Very different. We also started doing quarterly Black and Abroad events, trying to promote the idea that studying abroad is also a Black thing to do. Howard University has done an incredible job at promoting study abroad being a very Black experience historically, and how to do that. So we brought panelists and speakers to campus from our campus, as well as folks from outside of campus. These are just a few examples of how you can try to put into practice solidarity. We also have a Global Hornets program, which is a program focused on getting a cohort of first-gen students and trying to walk them from first year till study abroad and after study abroad as a cohort of first-gen students trying to engage in the study abroad process. Interpersonal. About 4 or 5 months ago, a student wrote to me an email and said, I want to go to Japan in this city on this program, and I want to know about major credits. So I wrote back my response. Thanks for writing. This is the policy. It's very clearly on our website. I also mentioned it in many of the informational seminars I do on campus. So the student's asking me, so I kindly respond. The student writes me again. Yeah, so I know the policy, but could I get a major credit? I said, well, you got to talk to the department. You have to see what the syllabus is. That you need to. Okay. Writes back again. He says, so I really want to get a major credit. And I was like, at this point, that top hat is coming back on. I'm like, I said it 3 times. That in my heart, in my gut, I'm like, what is going on here? And I respond again a 3rd time, explaining the best I could of what the policy is like and why. And so this 4th email from the student says, I'm failing a class, I don't think I'll get credit for it, and I think I'm going to need to do it on study abroad if I want to study abroad. Students are not going to tell you that in the first interaction. The student didn't know me, we were strangers. Now, through that process, after the 4th email, he was willing to reveal something that he didn't want to talk about. Didn't want to have to reveal, but really helps us do a better job if we actually knew that information. So our conversation totally changed. Another example I love, and this will be the last example I give, is it was in my 2nd year working at Kalamazoo College, and there was an event, a campus event, that I was invited to do a table for study abroad, and I went. And a group of 3 women came to the table, and we started talking. And they ended up talking to me about them being introverts. I'm an extrovert. I always have been. It's in the theater. And I have a daughter who's very introverted. My wife is very introverted. And so my concern, and I expressed this to them, was I'm really concerned that as an extroverted parent, that some of the things that I want my daughter to learn, to order her own food at a restaurant when we go out, I don't know if I'm doing a good job because I might be expecting something from her that's really uncomfortable in a way that for me is really comfortable. We had this beautiful conversation for half an hour about introversion and extroversion. Nothing about study abroad. This student ended up applying and going to China, studying in Beijing. Had some real bumps on the program and was really frustrated both with the provider as well as with me. We had a previous relationship, and she wrote me a 2-page single-spaced email about all of the issues that were going on. It was probably one of the hardest emails I've ever read, not because I can't handle criticism, but because it was a student that I cared about that was having a really difficult time in Beijing. And so I'm reading this, and I'm like, oh man. So I take the time, I think about it, and I write a really long email back, affirming what they're feeling. Most of the issues that were happening were not my fault. They were not my responsibility. And a lot of the things in the email were addressing things that were very normal to happen on study abroad. They weren't actually any errors, but they were expectations that were not met, That relationship ended up building to an extent where the student actually, her name is Kaylee. Kaylee ended up being on a special committee of students that I formed called the Student Advisory Board on Study Abroad in a Way. And for about a year, she and 3 other students met with me to talk about the difficulties of study abroad and how we can work on them. Once a month, 2 hours every meeting. During the pandemic, all virtual. She then went on to work at University of Michigan in their study abroad office, in one of the department study abroad offices, and now she works at FEA, the Fund for Education Abroad. She helped me create this presentation. So, I say all that to say, the seeds that we planted in that first conversation we had at this event when she was a first-year student at Kalamazoo College, I could have never known. So relating back to that gardening example, you've got to plant seeds and build relationships that you don't necessarily know if they're going to turn out like that. I am so happy she's still in the field. And if we want more people in the field that are critical thinkers, that want to push our industry, our field, better directions, we've got to develop those relationships.